The question is there a tribal policy in India? They do form, let's say, 8.6% of the total population of the country, scattered over the length and breadth of the country. And unlike scheduled castes, who are almost on every villages of in India, scheduled tribes you find are concentrated in certain pockets. And you find that these pockets are contiguous to different states. And therefore, you find that on those pockets, they really they are found in concentrations, a large segment of the tribal population really live. So if you really look at, is there a tribal policy? Or one finds that probably there is not. But when I was, let's say, a student like most of you, I always heard that there's a tribal policy which is known as Nehru's Panchsheel. And Nehru's Panchsheel, if you really carefully examine, you find that it's nothing else, but I think it's reflections on the kind of constitutional provisions that exist for the scheduled tribes. And he makes what is called 5 principles that you talk about, Panchshila. And I think some of these ideas that he has is that he says that tribal rights in land and forest must be respected. This is one of the very important things that he really talks about it. That what's called team of tribals must be trained in order to administer their own affairs. He says that they must develop according to their own genius rather than being imposed in terms of ideas and articulations from an outside. And that they must what's called be evaluated not in terms of the statistics or how much money that has been spent, but in terms of the quality of personality that really evolved. And they must develop according to their own genius. So these are the ways in which he talks about it. Now, that to my mind seems to be somewhere else. I've given some thought to it. It is something reflected in the provisions of the Indian constitutions. And if you look at Nehru's Panchshila, it primarily moves in the directions of integrating the tribes into the larger Indian society, because it gives a space to protect them, their interests and their identity, at the same time get integrated into the larger Indian society. And I think that's a very fascinating idea that there in the constitutions. Unfortunately, it is not really working in the manner in which constitution envisages. But if you really look at much of what is really happening, is rather than integrating, the drive in India, particularly from post-independent India, and particularly in the mainland India, in the northeast, is more of a drive to assimilate through various ways. And most important is if you look at the educational system, education which is being run for the tribals at the primary schools, etc. And I think increasingly you'll find that educational system has become one of the important ways in which you find in India is trying to, in a way, rather than integrate them, it's really trying to assimilate them. And if you really look at the way in which, let's say, the last budget, the allocations has been made, it is emphasizing on the residential schools, Eklavya, central schools, Kasturba schools, and so. And so basically it means that get away from the parents, from the region, go to the hostels, and get educated, and therefore in the process get alienated from their own family, from your own community, from own the regions. And that's the kind of a drive that is really happening. Now, if this is, so tribal policy, if you really look at what Constitution says and the way in which Jawaharlal Nehru enunciated this, and the book that was a philosophy for Nepha is Arunachal. One wonder whether that was really is the practice if you look at the mainland India. So was it this policy that we're talking about in some Panchshila, something specific for the Northeast or something specific for the Northeastern region, or it was really applicable to the whole of India? And if that one takes as a policy, then you find the practices, the standard way of carrying on the activities in terms of laws, in terms of regulations, in terms of activities is strikingly very different, let's say, if you look at in the peninsular India. So what is it that we are talking about the policy? Are we talking about the policy which are actually being pursued in the sense without making what's called very clearly outlined, but nevertheless the standard mode of action, standard behavior, standard practices, and that's reflected in the law and certain kinds of rules and regulations. So are we to go by that, or are we really go to by the kind of enunciations which Jawaharlal Nehru had made it? And I think to my mind, whereas Jawaharlal Nehru's idea seems to be more in the context of Northeast, it doesn't seem to be the guidelines in terms of which the peninsular India has worked. And therefore, in peninsular India, you find that it is much more, there are provisions, but it is more of the generalized policy, what you call the public policy, which is applicable for the whole of the population or whole of the region. That seems to be more pronounced than the specific policies that has been worked out, let's say, in some parts of the region. So if you really look at the tribals in India, you find that there are, if constitutionally if you look at, there are people who come in the 5th schedule areas, and there are 10 states in India who come under the 5th schedule. Not all the districts or not all the blocks in the what's called 10 scheduled states come under the scheduled areas, but nevertheless these are known as 10 scheduled states. The Northeast is by and large you find is the 6th schedule, where you find 6th schedule has been elevated to the tribal states. So you have Nagaland, you have Mizoram, you have Meghalaya, you have Arunachal Pradesh, but there are 3 more states where you find tribals are not really the ones who govern themselves, particularly Manipur, or you look at or Assam, or Tripura. So you find there is a variations, but nevertheless you find that the kind of legal and constitutional mechanisms that are available, let's say in the context of Northeast, is what you call the Autonomous Districts Council. 6th schedule provides for Autonomous Districts Council, and Autonomous Districts Council is provides a space to make legislations, what's called executive functions and judicial functions as well on certain subjects which are particularly connected with the land, forest, the customs, religion, and so on and so forth. Here you find that the law enacted by the parliament or state legislature is not applicable into the 6th schedule areas. Also, of course, Nagaland, for example, is not a 6th schedule, but nevertheless it has special constitutional status. And therefore you find that by and large, all the laws enacted by the parliament or state legislature are not applicable in the 6th schedule areas and states with a special constitutional status, until you find that the legislature, what is called, particularly special constitution, it makes a law in terms of accepting or extending that kind of provisions in their own respective states. So what you find that, as contrast to that, if you look at the mainland, particularly 10th, what is called the 5th schedule area, the 10 states, which are basically Telangana, Andhra in the south, you have all these Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, so and Himachal Pradesh. But so what you find that constitutionally look at, the tribals are 5th schedule areas and or special constitutional provisions, or you find there are 5th schedule areas which are again a special constitutional provision, and there are regions which are outside, there are tribals who live outside of the 5th and the 6th schedule. Particularly you find, if you look at Kerala, the Karnataka, Goa, Tamil Nadu, of course Bengal and all that, then they are outside of it. So constitutionally, this is the kind of mechanism. So if constitutionally things are different, there will be laws which will also be different. It can't be the same law, because constitution will have a constraint. And similarly, therefore, if the law is different, you find policy also is likely to be different. And therefore, you find that rather than one single policy, probably we have to talk about the policies in the context of tribal people. And that is the reason you find that if you look at the development indicators, you find that there's a big difference among the tribal communities themselves. If you took the Northeast, whether you take the people living below poverty line or their health status, or you take education particularly, you find that they are almost the same level as the general population in India. So they are, the poverty level is very low. In fact, most of the states have less than 20%. Unlike our education status, it's very high. It's almost average tribal is 58, but you will find that the average literacy status in the north is higher than the national average. So you find that, why is it that you find that for the northeast, the development indicator seems to be very good? But you compare it to the fifth schedule areas, particularly the 10 what's called states that we are talking about, you find that the development status is the worst in the country. Whether you talk about people living below poverty line, whether you talk about the health status, whether you are talking about or education, it is really the worst. Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra and Gujarat relatively better. So this is where you find the pool of problems about the tribal development, these 10 states. Those who are outside of the fifth and sixth schedule, particularly Kerala, you find the development indicators relatively better, and not as the same as the Northeast, but is relatively better. Whether you take education, health, or even the people living below poverty line, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Goa, better. So, but why is it that you find, therefore, that people who are outside the fifth and sixth schedule seems to have worked well, and the Northeast seems to have worked well, but the fifth schedule areas haven't really worked out. So that's, I think, something puzzling which we public policy students must really reflect and think about it. In case of those who are outside the fifth and sixth schedule years, yes, they have, but I think in the process they have also lost their identity, particularly language, the culture, and so on and so forth, which is not necessarily the case in the Northeast. Northeast, you find that they retain their language, their culture, their identity. At the same time, you find there is a very strong process of development. So there is a development with identity or identity-based or self-identity development there. Whereas in case of South India, although there's a development, because Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Goa, so there are developmental states, therefore the percolating effect of that is also happening on the tribals. But in the process, you find that probably the questions of the language is getting eroded, and linguistics or the cultural studies people will be quite worried about the fact that there is an erosion of tribal language. And in fact, Ganesh Devi, in fact, conducted I think few years back, linguistic survey of India, and he found that almost 600 languages are disappearing in India. And out of that, large number of tribal languages are disappearing. And if languages are disappearing, the diversity and the kind of knowledge, the knowledge about biodiversity, etc., these all gets problematic. So these are the issues that are there. So what we really find, therefore, is that rather than thinking of one single policy, probably there has been a different, since constitutions are there and there's a different legal provisions, and therefore from the legal provisions you have different kind of policy, it has worked differently, and therefore some regions it has benefited, some regions had not really benefited, and some has moderately. Now coming to, and therefore I'm really, when talking about public policy, I'm focusing, let's say, on mostly, let's say, in the fifth schedule area. Why is it that the fifth schedule areas becomes the, I think is the reason which actually in a way brings down the development indicators of India itself. So I talked about both poverty, illiteracy, or health status, particularly these 10 states. Himachal is an exception, so I could say 9 states. Now, why is it? Because here there is a fifth schedule provision which basically says, which fifth schedule provides that the governor is the custodian of the tribal people. Unlike in the sixth schedule where they are entitled to autonomous district council, there is an institutional mechanism whereby they can make legislations, executive, their activities, and judicial power. In case of the fifth schedule, you find that it is the governor who is the custodian of the tribals. And therefore, fifth schedule says that any act of the parliament or state legislature, if the governor likes, he may not extend those acts into the fifth schedule areas, or he may extend those acts with exceptions or modifications as it deems fit into the tribal areas. So that is the problem. In other words, you find that most of the acts which have been enacted by the parliament and the state legislature, which is an act of public good or public purposes, they are all getting implemented or enforced into the fifth schedule areas, although you find that in the fifth schedule you find that there is constitutionally a provision for protecting them, and it is the role of the governor to see that as to how they are really protected. But governors have not really exercised these constitutional provisions which have been mandated in the fifth schedule. Why they have not done it, that again has to be really looked at. Generally, it says that they have to go by the advice of the councils of ministers, which basically means that they have to abide by the kind of laws and policies which are framed by, let's say, state or the parliament, particularly in the case of states. So what it means? That basically means the public becomes a more important. And therefore, what really happens to the special laws which are there for the people, tribal people in the six scheduled areas? The Constitution aims at protecting them in the same way as you find in the Northeast. But the institutional mechanism is different. And that institutional mechanism that you find in the fifth scheduled areas is vested in the office of the governor. But governor in the last 7 decades have never exercised this power which has been there, and they have extended almost all the acts or laws which have been framed by the parliament and the state legislature into the fifth scheduled areas, which never happened in the case of the Northeast. That's the exception. So this doesn't mean that there has been, so constitutional provision is there, but in response to the constitutional provision, there has also been legislations. For example, in almost all the fifth scheduled states, you find that land from tribals to non-tribals cannot really be transferred. It is there. All states have enacted law. Even some non-fifth scheduled states like Kerala and West Bengal, they have also enacted law. But if you really look at the whole, even prior to independence, but even if you look at the post-independent India, you find that this has really been going on. If you look at the Ministry of Rural Development and check at their statistics, you find in 1999, they refer to around 468,000 cases of land alienations, almost involving 970,000 acres of land. 2007, again you look at it, says 5,000 cases or 500,000 cases. So you do find that despite a law enacted by the state in order to protect, you find that alienation actually, or transfer from tribals to non-tribals actually has been going on. So this is there. So that is one, and you scale at which it has been going on. And what really is happening is that there is also a restoration of land, alienated land, but even that restoration is not really taking place. So what is it that you find? That special laws are there, but it is not working. It is not working either because you find those who are managing the states doesn't really allow it. So what do you really do it? In the sense that there is alienation therefore, and the other more important that you find is the Land Acquisition Act. These are the states which are rich in mineral resources. Northeast you cannot exploit. But these are the regions which are important for the, what's called water resources, what's called the mineral resources. And if you look at the post-independent India in terms of public sector undertakings, where they have all come, they all have come into this fifth scheduled states. Ranchi was a small town, it's become a big town now, it's an industrial town. What's called Tata's, Jamshedpur is industrial town, Bokaro is industrial town. What's called in Odisha, you have there's Bengal, Raurkela. It's a tribal town. These were all not tribal, they're tribal areas, but they've converted into towns, and you just go and the tribals you can't see. So these are specific examples there. So what really is happening that on the one hand, there is alienation of land from tribals to non-tribals. The other, correspondingly, you find that the what's called the acquisitions of land, tribal land, by the state under the curb of what is called Land Acquisition Act of 1894. That, of course, amended only in 2013. But that has been going on. So you are acquiring land left and right, and there is also alienation. So you can see the extent of dispossession that has been going on into the fifth scheduled areas. And that is not because of that, but precisely because you find it's a very rich in mineral resources, and probably the growth of India or the development of India needs exploitation of those resources. So that is one. The other is that you cannot think of the tribals outside of the land and forest. So when land is passing, the forest, which also supposed to be under their control historically, under either the village, or you find the lineage or the clan forest. But this land and forest has, from the colonial period, had continuously or steadily moved away from the control of the tribals, unlike in the Northeast. So you find the more of the reserved forest, the protected forest, now you have wildlife sanctuaries. So all these, what really has happened is that rather than regularizing, rather than recognizing the rights of the people who were already there, rather than recognizing, you find that you don't recognize, and as a result of which you tend to think that they are encroachers and illegal occupants. But historically, if you look at, they were already there. It is the declarations by the forest department which has made them into illegal occupants. So you find that in the case of land, the problems are there. In the case of the forest, there is a problem. And you know, it was at the backdrop of this that you find there was what is called the order by the Supreme Court to evict all of these, I don't exactly remember, the millions of the forest dwellers from the forest. And you find in 2004, 2005, there were a lot of burning of the forest, destroying their houses, using elephants, and so on and so forth. There is arsones and all that by the police, the forest department, and so. And that really led to the enactment of the Forest Rights Act in 2006. And if you even look at the enactment of the Forest Act, it was not because of the government, but it was largely because of the push of the various tribal society organizations and large number of other civil society organizations which helped to push it. So that is one. Before that you had 2006, but before that you had PESA. In the sense the governor is not effective, so they wanted to give the power to the Gram Sabha. And therefore they enacted in parliament what you call the provisions of Panchayat extension to scheduled areas. So that came in 1996. And the state, since it is a state subject, they were supposed to amend in terms of or in tune with the central act or act passed by the parliament. But if you look at the act, or amendment which most of the states have brought about it, it's completely diluted the provisions of the central act. And interestingly, you find that there are a large number of states who have not even framed rules till today. So it is 1996, we are now in 2021, but the rules have not been framed, and without rules, how are you really going to implement it? So there is a certain kind of tampering that is going on, but there is no clear rule. Chhattisgarh just passed rules only last month or 2 months back. You find that Jharkhand is still under process. Odisha has not really passed. So only states which have passed is Maharashtra, Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Andhra. These are the states, but other states have not really passed rules, they have not framed rules. So how do you really implement an act which seems to be so radical, both in terms of empowering them and giving them an access to governing themselves, at the same time in terms of Forest Rights Act, because Forest Rights, implementation of Forest Rights is contingent on the Gram Sabha. So if state doesn't really take initiative, then I think these are the kind of problems that really come up. So what you really find is that the generalized policy, the policy of growth, policy of development, policy of conservation, policy of protecting, policy of diverting, etc., if you really look at, it is adversely impacting the kind of provisions, the kind of policies, or the kind of legislations which are enacted with reference to protecting the Adivasis in the fifth schedule. This is the problem that I see it. So how do we, as a public policy students, we really think about it? In the sense that are public policy invariably inclusive? If you look at most of the public sector undertakings, land acquisition that really took place, but if you really go to all these industries, you will not find tribals. They might have been working when industries comes, but once the industry really comes, then they don't appear. So you find dams, irrigation projects, electrifications. You go to the tribal areas in the fifth schedule and you find that their villages are not electrified, their land is not irrigated, they don't find an employment in the public sector undertakings. So how is it that you find that the public policy, which is supposed to include everyone, someone is not a part of that public policy, and you find that tribals really get excluded into it. But then you find that there is a special laws, but even that becomes a problematic. So how do we really look at the larger public policy or policy of, let's say, public good and special laws? Are there, therefore, privileging certain kinds of laws or certain kinds of policies over certain kinds of laws or the policies which seems to be oriented towards people who are on the margins of the society? So that's, again, is a problem. So how do we really look at? And you find that, well, if there are public policies where you find the state is giving, like reservations, that is one way. But if you find the public policies or the laws whereby it is taking away the land and forest and the life support system, that is quite different. You're snatching, you're dispossessing. So you're not giving, reservation is giving. And therefore, even if you are you're not really implementing it effectively, that's another kind of problem. But if you find a public policy or law which is actually dispossessing, that is of a very different kind. So how do we really are going to look at? So if you really look at the situations in the fifth schedule areas, you find that there is, the problem in the sense that how to think of a public good or a public law or public policy vis-a-vis special policies or a special law which is enacted to protect the vulnerability of the people. Now, if you really look at comparatively, if you look at in terms of examining with each other, then what you find that is there, therefore, it poses a big problem to affirmative action program. Affirmative action program, including reservation, it means that, well, you lift people from the situations in which they are. But here are situations, here are examples, and the large number of people involved, where you are making their life much more precarious by taking away their life support systems in terms of land and forest and making their livelihood. And then you want to do affirmative action program. It doesn't really work. I think it is not affirmative action program. So this whole idea of affirmative action program vis-a-vis the kind of larger political economy of development that is taking place, that has to be situated and see. I think these are the problems that have come up, and then one really wonders, therefore, is there anything like affirmative action program in India, particularly in the context of fifth schedule? I'm not saying that, but I'm questioning that whether there is an affirmative action program in the case of the fifth schedule areas. Or are we really talking about unequal exchange? What economists have talked about in terms of trade or unequal exchange, that we give you this and you give us this. So that's the kind of problem that we have. In other words, public policy may not necessarily lead to development of everyone. It's not inclusive, but public policy can also bring about the development of some segment of the population, and it can lead to underdevelopment of other segment of the population. So there is a twin dimensions of it, and as to who are going to benefit and who have to pay the price is a part of the larger political economy and a part of the larger structure of the political power and economic power that exists in Indian society.